Madam President, there will be parts of my comments that, for historical purposes, will be said in Spanish, and then I will translate them into English, so I ask unanimous consent that that be permitted.
Without objection.
Madam President, February 16th of this year marked 50 years since the revolution in Cuba that brought Fidel Castro and his brother Raul to power. Some have used this anniversary as an opportunity to put forth some romantic views of the revolution. So I've come to the floor today to talk about the realities of the situation in Cuba. The reality is this golden anniversary for the Castros is an impoverished anniversary for the rest of the country. Over the course of 50 years, the tides of romanticism have come and gone, but they have always crashed hard against the rocks of reality. All the pictures of Che Guevara on T-shirts can't hide the brutality of the declaration he made before the United Nations in 1964. He said then, "Hemos fusilado, fusilamos, y seguiremos fusilando mientras que sea necesario," which means we have executed people. We execute people now, and we will continue executing people for as long as we deem necessary. No words better sum up the character of the revolution. The Cuban regime has bent and gilded the spirit of their people over a rotten core of brutality, deprivation, and fear. Here are the realities of the last 5 decades on the island. According to the Free Society Project of the Cuban Archive, which has verification for every case, the number of people the regime has murdered or abducted numbers in the thousands, if not the tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands of children have been separated from their parents. Millions of men, women, and young people have been forced into the fields to cut sugarcane and perform other hard labor against their will. And here are the realities of Cuba today. The government is, pure and simple, a brutal dictatorship. Every now and then, the regime stages meaningless elections with 609 candidates, all 609 chosen by the regime, vying for only 609 seats in a National Assembly that does not do anything without the approval of the Castro brothers. Despite fertile soil and perfect climate, as well as significant financial assistance, access to food is tightly rationed. The average Cuban worker lives on an income of less than $1 a day. World Bank statistics show that fewer people have telephones, televisions, computers, and cars than in almost any other country in Latin America. The regime makes sure as few people as possible can use the internet. Even so that the percentage of people who have access in Cuba is less than in Haiti. The regime's claims about great progress in healthcare and education are immediately undermined by the costs paid in lives lost, economic opportunities stolen, and freedoms denied. The island was not rich in 1959, yet Cubans have fewer opportunities to get ahead than they did 50 years ago. Across a wide variety of indicators of human development, Cuba has watched other countries in Latin America make similar or even greater gains. And this poverty has an enormous cost. The widespread desperation of families has forced far too many young girls and boys into becoming sex workers, even though defenders of the revolution constantly cite the elimination of prostitution as one of its supposed accomplishments. In fact, a few years ago, Cuba was listed by Voyeur magazine as the sex tourism hotspot of the world. So much for that success of the revolution of eliminating prostitution. Castro revolution has been most adept, not at spreading education and prosperity, but at instilling penetrating fear and terror, perpetuating their own power through a Stalinist police state. The Cuban security forces were trained in torture by the dreaded Stasi of East Germany and carry on that legacy today. And if you doubt that, ask Senator McCain about one of his torturers in Vietnam, a Cuban agent. The world has expressed outrage at the treatment of detainees in the prison at Guantanamo Bay, and President Obama announced he would close it within a year. When the news of that decision reached Juan Carlos Herrera Acosta, who has spent more than 6 years in jail for his political views, he said, "Cuando el mundo abrirá sus ojos y diría que hay que cerrar los otros Guantánamos que existen en Cuba," which translated means, when will the world open its eyes and say that it's time to close the other Guantánamos in Cuba? There is no excuse for turning a blind eye to the 300 other prisons on the island, prisons that make Guantanamo Bay look tame by comparison. Armando Valladares, who wrote the prize-winning book Against All Hope, was imprisoned in the famous Isla de Pinos in 1960 for his opposition to communism. He lived through the hell of Castro's jail, suffering violence, forced labor, and solitary confinement. His writings were smuggled out, read throughout the world, and he was finally released after intense international pressure, 22 years after he was taken prisoner. Here are some of his memories of his captivity, and I quote, "I recall the two sergeants, Porfirio and Matanzas, plunging their bayonets into Ernesto Diaz Madruga's body. Boitel denied water after more than 50 days on a hunger strike because Castro wanted him dead. Clara, Boitel's poor mother, beaten by Lieutenant Abad in a political police station just because she wanted to find out where her son was buried. Officers threatened family members if they cried at a funeral. I remember Estevita and Piri dying in blackout cells, the victims of biological experimentation. So many others murdered in the forced labor fields, quarries, and camps. A legion of specters, naked, crippled, hobbling, crawling through my mind, and the hundreds of men mutilated in the horrifying searches they went through. Eduardo Capote's fingers chopped off by a machete, concentration camp, tortures, women beaten. And in the midst of that apocalyptic vision of the most dreadful and horrifying moments in my life, in the midst of the gray, ashy dust and the orgy of beatings and blood, prisoners beaten to the ground, a man emerged, the skeletal figure of a man wasted by hunger, with white hair and blazing blue eyes, and a heart overflowing with love, raising his arms to the invisible heaven and pleading for mercy for his executioners. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And a burst of machine gun fire ripping open his chest. Those are Armando Valladares' live memories of the 22 years he spent in Castro's jails. This has been going on since 1959, but unfortunately, it is not a thing of the past. In 2003, armed security forces raided 22 libraries and sent 14 librarians to jail with terms up to 26 years in prison, simply because they established a library in their community. Oh, how dreadful is the power of a book that could cause those people who created libraries to spend a quarter of a century in prison. That year, it rounded up 75 journalists, human rights activists, and opposition leaders, and gave them summary trials and sent them to jail for up to 28 years. And to put a human face, because sometimes we talk about dictatorships and the consequences of their actions, and we talk about people in mass numbers, but these are the faces. Osvaldo Payá, Marta Beatriz Roque, Oscar Espinosa Chepe, Armando Valladares, who I just quoted, and others, who actually languish inside the jails in Cuba and who have been beaten and or who ultimately have been harassed in the pursuit of peaceful civil society movements. In 2003, Fidel Castro ordered one of the most sweeping, brutal crackdowns on opposition figures in years, a roundup of 75 dissidents, and their summary trials. In that Black Spring, his agents took away Marta Beatriz Roque. She's an economist, a leader of a group called the Assembly for Promoting Civil Society, a coalition of non-governmental organizations dedicated to peaceful democratic change on the island. In 2003, she was sentenced to 20 years behind bars for the crime of wanting peaceful change, for the crime of speaking her mind. In prison, her diabetes and blood pressure made her so ill that the regime let her leave her tiny cell, but they didn't let her go far. 2 years later, the government sent a mob to attack her as she was traveling to meet a United States diplomat. They beat her, and when she tried to leave to get medical care, they trapped her in her home. She was 60 years old. Now, every day of her life, she knows she could wake up and be thrown in a cell once more, left to die for the crime of thinking independent thoughts, for the crime of asking for change. During the crackdown in the spring of 2003, Fidel Castro also arrested Dr. Oscar Elias Bisset. Dr. Bisset founded the Lawton Foundation for Human Rights, one of the first independent civic groups in Havana. On February 27th of 1999, he was arrested for hanging the national flag sideways at a press conference, and he was sentenced to 3 years in jail. He was protesting the forced abortions he was ordered to perform. After his release, he organized seminars on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for Cubans. And he was arrested again in December of 2002 for organizing this seminar. In April of 2003, he was sentenced to 25 years in jail and sent to a special state prison. This is his jail cell. His dark, damp cell is barely bigger than he is. In 2007, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor this country gives to anyone. But he has still not won something far more important, his own freedom. He still languishes in a cell like this. It is a myth that the tensions of activists has dropped off since Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's brother, took power. More than 1,500 were rounded up last year, according to the Cuban Commission on Human Rights and National Reconciliation, an independent observer group. They may be released temporarily, but they are always subject to rearrests. Multiple independent human rights organizations confirm that the Cuban regime is still holding more than 200 political prisoners that we know of. Independent journalists, economists, human rights workers, and doctors, all jailed for speaking their minds. In the United States, we saw an election last year that was all about a powerful call for change. The year before, 70 young Cuban youth were walking down the streets of Havana and detained simply for wearing a white wristband that has one simple word on it: cambio, change. Cambio, change. All they did was wear a simple white wristband to express what they wanted to see. While in the United States, the mantra of change can get you elected to the presidency of the United States, in Cuba, the mere suggestion of change can get you arrested. What an irony. The dictatorship maintains a network of spies on every single block. It is called El Comité por la Defensa de la Revolución, the Committee to Defend the Revolution. It is a block watch organization in every city, in every village, in every hamlet. If they suspect you, first you'll find yourself quietly demoted at work. Then you lose your job. You wake up one morning and your house will be covered in graffiti calling your family worms. You'll walk outside and your former friends will now spit in your path. The case of Adolfo Fernandez Sainz could hardly be more representative. He is a journalist forced to spend 15 years of his life behind bars, in part for the crime of owning the novel by George Orwell, 1984. 15 years of his life behind bars. But the saddest proof that a country is operated like a prison is when people are shot trying to escape. It was a hallmark of Soviet Russia and East Germany, Communist Hungary and Czechoslovakia. But today, the Caribbean is the Cubans' Berlin Wall. All boats and building materials belong to the state, so taking a ship into the waters or even building a raft can be considered crimes, often punishable by death. Cuban planes have attacked ships from the air. The Cuban Navy has attacked ships from the sea, surrounding boats, sinking them, sending men, women, and children to the bottom of the ocean. The Cuban archive has documented almost 250 cases of assassinations as people fled, in addition to the countless thousands who have died at sea, either drowning or being killed by sharks. Those Florida Straits, as people searching freedom, are the burial grounds of so many that we don't know. Cubans know the risks, and yet they continue to seek freedom. Since 2005, the Washington Post cites the number who have fled to America or have sought to fled to America at 80,000. Some of the country's best and brightest, risking arrest and death, leaving under the cover of darkness. Since 1959, according to the Center for the Study of International Migrations, nearly 1.7 million Cubans have been forced into exile. And for those who cannot leave, there is another sign of despair on the island. The World Health Organization data reveals a sad fact, that Cuba has one of the highest suicide rates in the hemisphere. Over 5 decades, we have seen democracy take hold in every country in the Western Hemisphere but one. One island, suspended in the past, resisting the tide of history, its people waiting for something to change. In 1962, the United States restricted commerce with and travel to Cuba. It stands as a legal, political, and moral statement that we reject dictatorship's abuses, and it serves as a way to weaken the regime. At the beginning, it was embargo in name only. U.S. foreign subsidiaries were allowed to freely commerce with Cuba, and it wasn't until the mid-1980s that these loopholes were closed. The Cuba Democracy Act and later the Libertad Act caused the Castro regime to downsize what had become the third largest military per capita in the Western Hemisphere. That was good for the Cuban people, good for the hemisphere, because Castro could no longer send his troops to promote revolution and destabilize Latin American countries. But that came about not out of ideological change by the Castro brothers. It came about as a result of economic necessity. The U.S. dollar, the most hated symbol of the revolution, illegal to own for quite some time, is now eagerly sought by the regime, creating a divide in Cuba. It is a divide between those who have access to U.S. dollars from their families and can use them at state-run dollar stores with prices that gouge those Cubans, and millions who have no family to send them dollars and chafe at the disparity. They question a regime that doesn't allow the freedom to work at jobs like tourism and others that might give them access to those dollars. And this conflict exists because these circumstances came about not as a change in Castro's ideology, they came about because of economic necessity. Economic necessity, not ideological change, further drove the regime to accept international investment, specifically in tourism and mining, something that was also previously illegal. And this has created resentment by Cubans who are sent to work at these establishments by a state employment agency where the Cuban who goes to work at these foreign companies, their labor is sent there, they have to go work there, they get paid in worthless Cuban pesos while the state gets paid in dollars for their labor. And they get a fraction of their labor's work every day. In addition, foreign companies summarily fire workers without recourse and get new workers from the State Employment Agency, no questions asked. Cubans have been denied access to visit these hotels in their own country, and now, only now, are they told they can do so if they can pay hundreds of dollars a night when they make less than $1 a day. Notwithstanding these economic challenges that have created pressure for change in Cuba, opponents of the embargo are quick to point out that it has been in place for many years and the Castros remain in power. They seem very confident that allowing more American money to flow into Cuba will magically topple the regime. The truth is, their prediction about cause and effect runs completely contrary to what's actually happened there. Over the years, millions of Europeans, Canadians, Mexicans, South and Central Americans, among others, have visited Cuba, invested in Cuba, spent billions of dollars, signed trade agreements, and engaged politically. And what has been the result of all of that money and all of that engagement? The regime has not opened up. On the contrary, it has used the resources and become more oppressive. Foreign funds often temporarily reach the hands of Cuban families, but they're then forced to spend those dollars in government-run dollar stores, so that the money ultimately winds up in the hands of the Cuban government, and many suspect in the secret bank accounts of the Communist Party elite. So allowing Americans to sit on the beaches of Valladero that Cubans cannot visit unless they work there, smoking a Cuban cigar for which a worker gets slave wages, sipping a Cuba Libre, which is an oxymoron, will not bring the Cuban people their liberty. And when the government isn't manipulating international aid, it sometimes rejects it altogether, as it did during last year's hurricane season, further punishing its people. And so I ask, to those who argue that lifting the economic embargo on Cuba means the demise of the Castro regime, nothing that I would want to see more. Why then has lifting the embargo been the #1 foreign policy objective of the Castro regime? Does it seek its own demise after 50 years? Certainly not. What it seeks is the economic viability to continue to perpetuate itself. But beyond the practical realities, I think there's also a broader principle at stake. Now, as power has passed somewhat, because Fidel is still alive, but from Fidel to Raul, from one dictator to another, are we to declare that their tyranny outlasted our will to resist it? When a murderer escapes the police and is a fugitive, do we declare them innocent after a few years just because we haven't caught them? Should we suddenly say it's too much for the Cuban people to be able to decide for themselves what course their nation will take? Should we decide to suddenly legitimize the behavior of the regime and strengthen its ability to continue perpetuating crimes? Which one of the freedoms we seek for the Cuban people as a condition of our full engagement as a country are we willing to deny them? Which one? Free speech? Free association? Freedom of religion? Freedom to politically organize and elect their leadership? Which one? Which one of those freedoms that we are willing to say to the Cuban people they cannot enjoy are we willing to give up? Now, I've also heard the suggestion from opponents of legal restrictions on Cuba that the United States has dealt with other brutal dictatorships more openly than this one. Those who make that argument must have a strange definition of a successful policy. If we consider prison camps and child labor, forced abortions and slavery, violent suppression of protests, Tiananmen Square, ethnic cleansing of Tibet, and a denial of human rights, be it in China or anywhere around the world, anywhere these violations are happening, if we are willing to accept that as successful engagement, I believe we're deeply mistaken. The disregard of human rights violations for the sake of economic gain in the past is never an argument to do it again in the future. Madam President, a full and open discussion of the real situation in Cuba is timely for more reasons than the 50th anniversary of Castro's revolution. It is timely because in this omnibus appropriation bill that we have before us, there are some who have attempted to sneak in changes to our current policy. But perhaps the greatest irony of all is that this bill includes three important foreign policy changes with respect to Cuba that have not been subjected to debate in this body. They have not been questioned for their impact on both our national interests and our national security. They have not gone through the Foreign Relations Committee. They have not been subjected to a vote on the floor of either the House of Representatives or the United States Senate. These modifications deserve a full examination. They should be subjected to vigorous debate. We should gather evidence, bring a wide range of voices to the table, and make careful and thoughtful considerations of their implementations. But this isn't what's taken place. Instead, this body is being asked to swallow these changes in the crudest process I can imagine, without analysis, without inclusion, and without debate. Now, supporters of these modifications claim that they are carrying them out in the hopes of fostering democratic change in Cuba, even as they do so in a way that silences democratic debate in our country. The United States cannot claim to be a model for democratic process and inclusive change if we find ourselves resorting to such undemocratic means. Jamming these foreign policy changes in an omnibus appropriations package by a handful of members at the exclusion of the rest of this body, not to mention the rest of the other body, and not to mention the executive branch whose jurisdiction these changes fall within, is simply not democratic. These changes come in the same week that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's ranking member and my very dear distinguished colleague from Indiana, Senator Lugar, produced a staff trip report. I've seen it quoted as the committee's report. It's a staff trip report. And I respect that that has some value, but it's not the full committee's undertaking and approval. The memo suggests some of the very things we see in this omnibus. But instead, in my view of a responsible report, this document presents a loose set of recommendations based upon a few days of observations on the island by a single source, and none of it quotes the fact that there was an engagement with one human rights activist, with one political dissident, with one democracy activist, with one independent journalist, not one. Now, I ask you, Madam President, does it make any sense that we would see such a basis for a report based upon what are clearly superficial observations, followed by sweeping and untested recommendations about how we should engage with the last totalitarian dictatorship in the Western Hemisphere? Madam President, let me just point out a few of the main contradictions in that report. First of all, the lack of focus on democracy and human rights in the memo was astonishing to me. In a legal sense, support for Cuba's pro-democracy movement is at the core of U.S. policy towards Cuba. It is represented in law under the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996. The report doesn't even mention the centrality of representative democracy in U.S. policy towards Cuba and the entire hemisphere. By the same token, the memo does not even mention that the United States of America is the world's largest provider of humanitarian assistance to the people of Cuba, through both individual assistance and non-governmental organizations. This fact makes it undisputably clear the focus of U.S. policy is the Cuban people, not its regime, advocating for their freedom and empowering them to bring change. The way the memo addresses the economic situation on the island is no less of an enormous flaw. On the one hand, this memo claims that economic sanctions have been ineffective. But on the other hand, it says, and I quote, that, quote, popular dissatisfaction with Cuba's economic situation is the regime's vulnerability. What a contradiction. But it would be even more of a contradiction for the United States to do anything to rescue the regime by improving its economic fortunes, therefore neutralizing its vulnerability. This report says that the popular dissatisfaction, the people's dissatisfaction with Cuba's economic situation is the regime's vulnerability. And yet, at the same token, all of its suggestions drive us in a direction in which we would help the regime, at the end of the day, be able to overcome that vulnerability. And yet, that's exactly what one of the recommendations in the memo is included in the omnibus would do. That suggested policy change would give the Cuban regime financial credit to purchase agricultural products from the United States. On its face, that would seem like a concession to American farmers, and we certainly want to see American farmers sell all over the world. But let's think about this for a moment. Anyone applying for even a small loan in our country right now has to undergo serious financial scrutiny. And if their credit record is poor, they would be rejected for that loan. Well, Cuba's credit history is horrible. The Paris Club of Creditor Nations recently announced that Cuba has failed to pay almost $30 billion in debt. Among poor nations, that's the worst credit record in the world. So I ask, if the Cuban government has put off paying those who it already owes $30 billion to, why does anyone think it would meet new financial obligations to American farmers? And considering the serious economic crisis we're facing right now, we need to focus on solutions for hard-working Americans, not subsidies for brutal dictatorships. We should evaluate how to encourage the regime to allow a legitimate opening, not in terms of cell phones and hotel rooms that Cubans can't afford to own, but in terms of the right to organize, the right to think and speak what they believe. However, what we're doing with this omnibus bill, Madam President, is far from evaluation. And the process by which these changes have been forced upon this body is so deeply offensive to me and so deeply undemocratic that it puts the omnibus appropriations package in jeopardy, in spite of all the other tremendously important funding that this bill would provide. The real reason why so many, and we've all of a sudden seen this barrage of reports that come particularly from outside of this body, whose work, by the way, is often subsidized by business interests, advocate Cuba policy changes is really about money and commerce, not about freedom and democracy. It makes me wonder why those who spend hours and hours in Havana listening to Fidel Castro's soliloquies cannot find minutes for human rights and democracy activists. It makes me wonder why those who go enjoy the sun of Cuba will not shine the light of freedom on its jails full of political prisoners. It makes me wonder how they advocate for labor rights in the United States but are willing to accept forced labor in Cuba. They talk about democracy in Burma, but they are willing to sip rum with Cuba's dictators. Madam President, there's another report that came out last week, a report I hope this body does not vote on the omnibus without reading. It's the State Department's 2008 Human Rights Report, and I want to read from it at length, just in case some of my colleagues don't have the opportunity. It says, referring to Cuba's human rights situation, and I quote, "The government continued to deny its citizens their basic human rights and committed numerous serious abuses. The government denied citizens the right to change their government. As many as 5,000 citizens served sentences for dangerousness without being charged with any specific crime. The following human rights problems were reported: beatings and abuse of detainees and prisoners, including human rights activists, carried out with impunity; harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, including denial of medical care; harassment, beatings, and threats against political opponents by government-recruited mobs, police, and state security officials; arbitrary arrests and detention of human rights advocates and members of independent professional organizations; denials of fair trials; interference with privacy, including pervasive monitoring of all private communications." It goes on to say, Madam President, and again I quote, "There were also severe limitations on freedom of speech and press, denial of peaceful assembly and association, restrictions on freedom of movement, including selective denial of exit permits to citizens and the forcible removal of persons from Havana to their hometowns, restrictions on freedom of religion, and refusal to recognize domestic human rights groups or permit them to function legally, discrimination against persons of African descent, domestic violence, underage prostitution, trafficking in persons, and severe restrictions on workers' rights, including the right to form independent unions, were also problems." And that's the end of the quote, all from the latest State Department report on human rights in the world, in this case, talking about Cuba. President Obama often repeats what Martin Luther King understood, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. People of Cuba have never given up on their legitimate aspirations for democracy and economic freedom, and now is not the time to give up on them. Just because we can't do everything doesn't mean we shouldn't do everything we can. A new American president does mean an opportunity for change. President Obama, who saw repression in Indonesia when he was a child, promised us this. He said in a speech in Florida as a candidate, quote, "My policy toward Cuba will be guided by one word, libertad." That means freedom. And the road to freedom for all Cubans must begin with justice for Cuba's political prisoners, the rights of free speech, a free press, and freedom of assembly, and it must lead to elections that are free and fair. That's the end of part of his speech. So here's what I think we can do to help that happen. Much has been written about seeking a change in our policy. Let me offer some changes as well, as someone who has followed this his whole life. In exchange for more liberal remittances to Cuban families, let us insist that the Cuban regime not charge 20% of every dollar sent to Cuba. So I have family in Cuba, and I want to send them money to help them out in desperate times, and I send them $100. The Cuban regime takes 20 of those $100. Why? If you go to Western Union, you send money any place in the world, maybe it's 3, 4, 5%, not 20. The regime is taking money for itself, denying Cuban families the very opportunity to have more. Let us also allow remittances via license to human rights activists, democracy activists, and other civil society activists. We want, some suggest that there be cooperation with Cuba on narcotics trafficking. Well, let them hand over the 200 fugitives from the United States that the FBI knows are in Cuba, including Joanne Chesimard, the convicted killer of New Jersey State Trooper Werner Forrester. Let her come back to the United States and face justice here. 200 of them. In exchange for more frequent visits from Cuban-American families that bring money and resources to the island, let us insist that the Cuban regime permit those who want to travel to Cuba and visit human rights activists, democracy activists, independent journalists, and other civil society advocates be given visas as well. Be given visas as well. Today, members of Congress who want to do that, and others who want to promote democracy and human rights, as we do through organizations throughout the world, who want to go to do that in Cuba, are routinely denied entrance into Cuba. Those who want to sit with Castro and let him speak for hours about the revolution, they get a visa. Those who want to go and talk to these people who languish inside of either Cuba's jails or detained in their home or struggling to create democracy, and so many others like them, no, you can't get a visa. So they're happy to accept those who bring dollars, but not those who speak truth to power. Let us have the United States offer more visitor and student visas for eligible Cubans to come to the United States to see and live our way of life. Having Americans travel to Cuba could never be as powerful as having Cuban youth see the greatness of our country and its pluralistic, diverse, representative democracy. That taste of freedom would be infectious. And in return, we simply seek a commitment from Cuba to accept their citizens' return and to guarantee the issuance of exit permits for all qualified migrants. Cuba is one of the few countries in the world that will not permit its citizens to travel even when they have a legitimate visa to do so. And when they give them license to leave, they must pay to do so. If we want to facilitate the sales of food to Cuba, let us insist that they be sold in open markets, available to all Cubans, without being part of Castro's food rationing plan, a plan meant to further control the Cuban people. And for those who disagree with our policies towards Cuba, let them ask themselves, what are they doing to promote democracy, human rights, and civil society in Cuba? What are they doing to support Antunes and Oswaldo Payá and Marta Beatriz Roca and Oscar Elias Becer? What are they doing to cast an international spotlight on Cuba's valiant human rights activists, Cuba's equivalents of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Václav Havel, or Lech Walesa? Do they sit back as they languish in jail or are harassed? Or do they invite them to their embassies in Cuba to speak in their countries about the struggles for freedom? Do they raise the issue of human rights in Cuba with the Castro regime? Do they cast a spotlight on this people, as we did in Poland with Lech Walesa, as we did in the former Czechoslovakia with Václav Havel, as we did with Solzhenitsyn? In pursuing any proposal or policy change, we have to recognize, as President Obama made clear to repressive regimes throughout the world in his inaugural address, that we extend a hand if they are willing to unclench their fist. However, if the omnibus bill is signed by the president as is, he will be extending a hand while the Castro regime maintains its iron-handed, clenched fists. During his presidential campaign, then Senator Obama promised this. He said, quote, "I will maintain the embargo. It provides us with the leverage to present the regime with a clear choice. If you take significant steps towards democracy, beginning with the freeing of all political prisoners, we will take steps to begin normalizing relations." He went on to say that's the way to bring about real change in Cuba, through strong, smart, and principled diplomacy. That's the end of the quote from his speech. That was the policy the Americans understood he would pursue when they voted for him. I believe then that candidate Obama meant what he said, and I believe now that President Obama intends to remain true to his word. Following our conscience and following our laws, we simply cannot let up our pressure on a regime without seeing symbols of progress. Madam President, the United States and the international community must continue to work diligently to help bring freedom to Cuba. But we cannot forget how many valiant efforts have come within Cuba itself, how decades of fear and repression have also led to acts of courage. I stand here today in solidarity with all of those brave Cubans who have sacrificed and shown remarkable courage so that one day the Cuban people will finally know the basic blessings of liberty that we are entitled to as human beings and that we in this nation enjoy. Just days ago, 130 Cubans kept vigil outside of the Placetas Hospital, waiting for news about the condition of a young activist, Iris Tamara Perez Aguilera, who had gone into a hypoglycemic shock after a hunger strike to protest the regime. This is it's not the best picture in the world, but it's what we got out of Cuba. This is a picture of some of them talking about in this home lives those who are having a hunger strike for peaceful change and for respect for human rights, and specifically talking about against the torture of one of their colleagues. She has been joined in her hunger strike by her husband, Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunes, along with Segundo Rey Cabrera and Diosiri Santana Perez. They have vowed to continue their protest until the torture of political prisoner Mario Alberto Perez Aguilera, held at the Santa Clara Provincial Prison, ceases immediately. They will continue their protests until he is taken out of a tiny, solitary confinement cell, until he is no longer beaten and forced to starve, until the regime allows Antunes' sister, Caridad Garcia Perez, to rebuild her home destroyed by the hurricanes last year, which they have not allowed as further punishment to these actors. Imagine that. Your home is lost at a hurricane, and you want to rebuild it, and the regime stops you from being able to build the home as further punishment because of your peaceful efforts to try to create change and a respect for human rights in the country. When Iris emerged from the hospital the other day, Cuban citizens waiting outside surrounded her to express their thanks and support for what she was doing. They hope she'll keep up her work with an organization named for an American pioneer they deeply admire. It's called El Movimiento Feminista de Derechos Civiles Rosa Parks, the Rosa Parks Women's Civil Rights Movement. Hundreds of political prisoners and all Cubans who live with the daily chains of political repression have shown their commitment that Cuba will change, and this change will come from within, from the Cuban people. But they need our help. We must continue to fight here to do what we can to empower them, and we must continue to acknowledge them when they empower themselves. Let me close by quoting what President Obama himself has quoted. He quoted the great Cuban patriot José Martí, who once wrote, quote, "It is not enough to come to the defense of freedom with epic and intermittent efforts when it is threatened at moments that appear critical. Every moment is critical for the defense of freedom." This year, 50 years later, Cuba is still in a cold winter of poverty and oppression. But I hold up hope that people all around the world, and most importantly within Cuba itself, will use this remarkable moment, and every moment, as they are doing, as these men and women are doing, to bring about a new birth of freedom, to rise up in a groundswell that will thaw the frost of tyranny and bring about a spring of hope and change. Change the Cuban people can believe in, change that they are praying for. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
before my friend leaves the floor, I have had the opportunity to listen to not all, but 80% of what you've said. I've had meetings going on in my office and have been able to watch it all. As the distinguished senator from New Jersey knows, I have locked arms with the congressman and now senator from New Jersey for many years. In fact, my votes in years past have not always been in the majority, but they've always been something that I felt comfortable doing and still feel comfortable doing. I appreciate the statement made by my friend from New Jersey, and I am committed to work with him to see what we can do to resolve the injustice that's taking place 90 miles off the shore of America, and once and for all, give those people who live in Las Vegas. Mr. President, people don't realize the largest number of Cuban Americans live in Florida. next New Jersey, and surprisingly, next Nevada. And I've worked with my friends there, Tony Alamo and many others over the years to try to bring justice to an unjust system. So I appreciate very much the statement made by my friend from New Jersey and look forward to working with him on all other issues.
Majority Leader, yield for a moment.
Yeah.
I want to thank the distinguished Majority Leader for his long-time support for the Cuban people, for taking votes and positions when it isn't within the popular mainstream. And I appreciate his expression of support here today as a continuation of that long history. And you have my personal admiration, and more importantly, those who are struggling for freedom and democracy inside of Cuba appreciate it as well.
Mr. President, the people of Virginia, Nevada, New Jersey, and the other 47 states are well served by my friend from New Jersey.